Hello everybody, welcome to Live on Mars. I'm Alex, CEO and founder of MarsBased, and in this episode we talk about M&A, mergers and acquisitions, one topic that we had already covered 1 year ago with Mike Counihan from Transcend Partners, and guess what? He's back. We're going to be talking again about this because in the last 6 months we've seen a lot of consolidation in the market, a lot of M&A, a lot of companies selling, a lot of companies acquiring companies, especially in our sector, in the sector of development and consultancies, where some of them they have exited to bigger companies, to some bigger consultancies, some they have exited to product, like the case of CodeGram selling to Factorial, or in the case of ProcRails from Poland selling to Shopify, for instance, right? We have been approached as a company to be sold to some companies in the market, which we're not going to disclose because mostly we are rejecting all these kind of talks. We're not interested in selling. However, there's a lot of spam coming our way with this kind of proposals, right? So we're going to be discussing with Mike, we're going to be following up the conversation that we had 1 year ago about the different stages of the negotiation. So when is a good time to reach out a potential acquirer, how to do it, with whom to do it, what kind of documentation do you need, how much money are you prepared to be willing to pay upfront for all the fees and lawyers and documentation that you have to prepare and whatnot, best practices, things that, could go wrong if you do it this way. So do's and don'ts, there's a lot of them. But we're also talking with very, very specific examples and things that anecdotes that we can share from our clients or things that we have lived ourselves with these kind of processes, right? So we'll be talking about some of our clients. We'll be talking about the acquisition of ValuationMetrics by Citadel. We're talking about Spin, our other client from the US, the e-scooters company that was part of the Ford Group and has been sold to Tier. And right now they're under management from Germany. So we'll have to go and meet the new direction, the new leaders of this team, because we are transitioning as well as providers of Spin. We'll be working now for Tier. So these kind of things from the perspective of the service provider, right? And in the last, perhaps the most interesting part of it for me, it was what happens after the acquisition, right? So how can you be incentivized to stay in the company? Why is it that sometimes the leaders of the companies just cash out and fuck off after having sold the company? And how can they, or why most companies don't take into consideration the team? So we have seen the deceiving episode of MailChimp, just like cashing out the founders, mostly a bootstrap business, and then kind of deceiving and letting down all their employees. I don't know, like I've got very blunt opinions on that. You will see them in this episode, or you will hear them if you're watching to the audio only version of this episode. So I hope that you enjoy it. And remember, if you like this kind of podcast, you like this kind of content, just hit a like and subscribe and share and give us stars and reviews on all the platforms that you're listening or watching this, because that really helps us. We're super thankful. The podcast is growing. We're hitting now pretty big numbers, significant big numbers, and we're really happy about the impact that this podcast is having, right? Where we have given people new jobs. We have hired thanks to this podcast. We're getting projects thanks to this podcast. And also the people who have come here as guest speakers, they're getting also new jobs, or they're getting new project requests, they're getting business, they're even co-founding companies with people that they have met through the podcast. They're really happy about this impact and really thankful for all your listening and watching of Live on Mars. So keep going at it because you're doing a great job. I'm super thankful. And let's jump right into this episode. Let's go.
Hello, good morning, Mike. Welcome to Live on Mars. How are you doing?
Good morning, Alex. It's been a while. Great to see you again.
It's been a while, but you were here, I think it was like 1 year ago, we recorded 2 episodes about M&A. And looks like the market is really hot right now. So we'll be talking about M&A again. How
Wonderful.
Are you feeling about that?
That's my work. I'm quite used to it. Sounds good.
You got one great presentation in which you talk about maximizing the exit value. So kind of like best advice to maximize the exit value for your company, which is a compendium of 8 bullet points, in which we're going to go through them very quick, because a few of them we have already covered. So for our audience, if you check part 1, part 2 of how to find the best M&A value for your company, we have recorded these ones with Mike already 1 year ago. But we're going to go as a general recap through all of them, and then kind of like focus on the last part of the exit process, negotiation, and maybe what happens after, clauses, permanence, and whatnot. So you ready to do this, Mike?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Let's start with the first one. We're going to go very quick through the first 5 or 6 because, as I said, we have already covered. But I think it's interesting to kind of like lay down the foundations of what we're going to be talking later.
Yeah.
And also because 3 of our clients have gotten acquired in the last 6 months in different kinds of acquisitions, right? So there's a lot of market consolidation out there. The first one would be knowing your valuation, right? So what are the general tips that you would give to a company to know your valuation? Is this something you can calculate yourself? You go to an M&A boutique? Is there an online tool? How do you do that?
Yeah. No, it's pretty simple, and like so most companies I find have a pretty good idea of kind of what their valuation can be. And this is maybe a little bit more relevant for companies that have not raised a funding round in the last couple of years. But it's really important to have an idea and a realistic idea. And most of the advice, I think I'm giving is more for when you want to do a proactive M&A process. So when you're just kind of receiving inbounds, I think it's still very, very important to know your value. And I'll give you an example in a second. But if you're doing a proactive process, first of all, if you don't kind of have a pretty good idea of what your valuation is, then maybe it doesn't even make sense to do this M&A process because you could be disappointed. You could go to the market, you think your company is worth 50 million and actually it's only worth 30 million. So it could be, maybe if you knew that in advance, maybe you would save yourself a lot of time and pain and not, and wait a couple of years or wait until your business is more developed or in advance to try to get that 50 million number that you're looking for. So that's kind of one, obvious reason. Even if you're doing a proactive process to know kind of the value or have at least an idea of what the value is. Because as we talked about in the last podcast, the real value of the company is the value you get if you actually do a complete M&A process, you'll get offers. And then the value that gets accepted is what we would say is the real value of your business. Of course, there are certain things you can do to improve that value. I'm talking about an efficient, true, comprehensive M&A process. If you're just kind of receiving inbounds and accept one of those inbound offers, that's not an efficient process. So that's, probably you left some money on the table, although maybe not. So in any case, that's, we don't really know if that's the true value of your company, what was purchased. But to give...
Yeah. Sorry, you wanted to give the example, right?
Yeah, I wanted to give an example because, so for my work, we work on the sell side pretty much exclusively. We're working with entrepreneurs. I was an entrepreneur myself years ago. I had a startup. So I think it's much more interesting and exciting to work with entrepreneurs. And so that's what we focus on. But years ago, we did work on the buy side. We did some buy side processes. And in several of those processes, I remember many examples of reaching out to companies. So part of our job was to reach out to startups ourselves to see, if they could have interest in being acquired on behalf of my clients. So one example, we worked with a Central European, one of the major technology companies in Central Europe, and they asked us to try to find fintech companies in the DACH region, in the Benelux region, even in Italy. So we were reaching out to many of these companies and they were more precise on what they wanted. It wasn't just fintech. It was kind of specific B2B banking tech. But in any case, we were reaching out to these companies. And in one of the first conversations, sometimes we would ask, do you have a minimum valuation in mind or a value in mind, after they had expressed interest in possibly being acquired. And in many cases, the company, sometimes they would say no answer. They would say, no, we're not really sharing that, or we haven't, we have an idea in our mind, but, we don't want to talk about that. Other times they would say a number that was kind of high, but many times they said a number that was actually considerably below their real valuation. Oh, wow. So this is like a dream scenario for a buyer. So it's kind of, and obviously maybe they'll do their homework later and figure out that the number they said at the beginning of the process was too low. But in any case, this is what a buyer absolutely loves. So they find you in a proactive process, you're running your business and you say, oh, I'd be willing to sell for, 40 million, but really the value of your company is 70 million. So, as far as market, what you would be if you did a comprehensive process in the market, most likely. And so this is, one of the key things. So if you're going to, whether it's inbound or outbound, kind of having a good idea of what your valuation is a key aspect. And, if you hire a banker, obviously that's one way, but there's probably other ways, looking at comparables is I think the best way to do it. So
you mean similar companies that have sold previously, right?
Exactly. So that's the best way. Like a DCF, the relevance tends to be less. If we were doing a valuation, we would do a comprehensive valuation that's DCF, private company comparables, which is just what you mentioned, Alex. Even looking at some public company comparables, because those companies are also, more liquid. Their value is relevant to the value of a private startup's value as well. But if you want to get a general idea, looking at the private company comparables, so other very similar tech companies to yours that have sold recently, what multiples did those trade at? That's a good way to get an idea. And you can get an idea, we use tools like PitchBook, Merger Market. You could possibly get a free trial subscription to PitchBook, something like that. They might give you like a week for free. Or you can just kind of search on the web. You could have maybe an intern or somebody in your company, to do, spend a couple of days trying to dig up every company, in your sector and seeing what kind of valuations they traded at, and only in the last 2 years. If some company sold 7 years ago for some amount that was quite similar to yours, I'm not saying there's no relevance to that, but it's far less in the last ideally in the last year, but I would cap it at 2 years if you actually want to have a realistic idea by using private comps.
Yeah, so and actually, when there's one thing, I wanted to quickly circle back to the example that you gave about like this company, maybe they set a considerably lower value of what they could have sold for. And that reminds me of negotiation basics, right? Negotiation 101. And it is that never say your price first, right? Let the other party make an offer first, because maybe you're thinking too low and you don't know it. And you were expecting you're good with 40 because 40 is good enough for you, but they would be willing to pay 50 or 70. So you're losing 30 million. On the other hand, there's actually the concept of anchoring, right? So you really
I was about to tell you that exactly. Once you said the other party should always talk first, I was thinking, that's a safe
you
route.
can explain better. But go for it.
No. It's exactly what you're saying. I think the safest thing to do is to let the other parties talk first. So if you're kind of unsure of yourself and you haven't done a really intense negotiation strategy, letting the other party talk first is the safe way to go for sure. If you're more aggressive, and this is a higher risk, possibly higher reward strategy, is to try to anchor the other side. So, saying some really high number, they ask you what your value is. And instead of saying, if you think your value is 4 times revenue, for example, instead of saying 4 times revenue, you say 9 times revenue, something like that. Of course, we heard that a lot, when I was working on the buy side, and sometimes that just turns off the buyer. I would say very often the buyer will just, because usually, especially when you get approached, you're not the only one they're approaching. They're approaching a lot of, similar companies to yours.
That's a good point.
So when you say, so when you come out with a number that's considerably above your valuation, it's possible that they absolutely love your company and they'll still, continue in the conversation with you. But very often, but it is a high risk, strategy in this case, because many times the buyer will just focus on other parties. So, but but one reason to possibly use that strategy, especially if it's an inbound, if you're not really necessarily interested in selling, is maybe you only want to sell at 9 times revenue or some high number, and your valuation's 4 or 5 times revenue, but that's not what you're interested in. You want a number quite a bit higher than that. So for an inbound process, I think, maybe, if I'm only going to sell it above X number, to say that number can save everyone a lot of time. So.
Yeah, well, actually, and that's another thing that maybe, like, on the other hand, anchoring, like, you might want to anchor. Probably that's the best strategy if you really don't want to sell your company, right? You really don't want to sell, but if it's stupid, fuck you money, right?
Exactly.
You're like, I don't know. I know my company is worth like 30, but I don't want to sell it. I'm super confident. Like, we're growing so fast. Like, we've got these ideas. We're going to crush it. And I've sold the company previously. And maybe I sold it for too little. For this one, I really want or really stupid numbers, or I'm not going to sell. So say I'm going to say 100 or 120, because then that anchors the negotiation there. And, you know, if they were thinking, okay, we can negotiate 20% down, you're negotiating 20% down from a really stupidly high number, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's a good strategy. Okay.
Yeah. So I think for the inbound people, that's a good strategy. If you're actually doing a proactive strategy, then having in mind your real valuation is better. And then if you end up getting that stupid money, that's still possible to get that offer. But at least you're not going to waste a ton of time and effort in this process if that's the only thing you'll accept.
Is there any case in which you would do proactive or outreach and go for that kind of strategy in which you say a really stupid high price?
No, the general
Not
strategy,
really, right?
the general strategy when you're doing a proactive process is you don't say a number. So you keep your mouth shut, you know,
Makes sense.
and then the buyer asks you and they say, you know, what kind of valuation are you looking for? And you say, you know, we're not really disclosing that. We're speaking with many different parties, and, you know, we're looking for, you know, the best offers, you know, something along those lines. Obviously, you would polish the statement a little better than that, but that's more or less the idea of what you say. So
Okay. Well, that's good for the first point. Let's jump to the second one, which would be preparing your documentation, right? So having your documentation ready. Probably, I'm guessing, like, we covered that already 1 year ago, but I don't remember that much about this specific part, but I'm guessing that it speeds up the whole process, and the faster you're able to deliver everything, the better, because I'm assuming, as you said, like, they're talking to many parties, right? So the faster ones usually have a competitive advantage, maybe?
Yeah, so there's exactly, Alex. So there's common sense reasons, which is kind of what you just mentioned, but there's beyond that even, there's something that's really important, which is if you don't have the documents ready and you're delaying, and especially if you're delaying and you say that this is the reason why, that's the worst thing you can possibly do. You know, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but what it signals is that they're the only party at the table. So they're the only one. So that's a negative signal. If it's an inbound situation, maybe that's not the worst signal in the world, but you still don't want to be dragging your feet. But if you're actually kind of interested in selling and want to do a somewhat proactive thing, the first parties you're talking to, if you don't have things ready, then every one of them is going to think they're not talking to anybody, because if they were actually in conversations and there was other parties interested, they would have this already ready. So.
That's a good point. It reminds me, like, last year we went through a lot of procurement processes for big companies. So we started working for HP, for FC Barcelona, for instance, and for a couple of other corporates. So the thing is, like, for the first one, obviously, because we haven't done any procurement for like a couple of years, the first one took a long time, especially because there was GDPR involved and a third-party audit and whatnot, right? So it took a long time. But when the second one came, like, I think it was FC Barcelona, I was like, well, I've got all of this documentation ready. And they were like, oh, wow, that was fast. Like, we didn't expect you to send it the same day. It's like, we literally did it last week. So that was good timing. But of course, you want to have all that documentation ready, but that takes a lot of time and a lot of money. So it's not like you would be willing to do that effort for no real reason, right? There's got to be something tangible on the table. So maybe you're willing to burn out the first acquisitor or the first, maybe company approaching, because you want to make sure that you're paying for something that you're going to use.
Okay, interesting point. So if I would, give a slightly different opinion on that. So
sure,
if you're actually doing a proactive approach, you definitely want to have.
I'm always thinking inbound. Sorry about that. Like, I'm a 100% inbound person.
Because I mean, every single process I've worked on, we get interested parties, we get parties coming and saying they want to learn more every single time, 100% of the time. Whereas you're right, if it's inbound, maybe you wait. Or, I mean, if it's inbound, you could also just kind of, you could use your last pitch deck from an investor and kind of, quickly improve that, and obviously, and in some ways that might not be a bad signal because it shows, it's inbound and, you're not looking to be sold. So you can kind of,
that's what I'm signaling from here.
Exactly. So I'm signaling I'm not, looking to be sold, but I'm also not going to make you wait for 4 weeks while I prepare this document. So exactly. So that's basically the idea.
How much would that cost? And how many documents we're talking about? Like, how long does this process take?
Yes, I mean, it's a banker was only, any banker that's, that I've ever heard of that's any good would only prepare this document if they're doing a whole process. Okay. Because bankers make their money on the success fee.
Okay.
So we charge a monthly fee, but the real, what we're really pushing for is the success fee. And the success fee only happens upon completion of the transaction. So you're not going to be able to hire a banker to just work on this. We call it the SIM document, like the confidential information memorandum, because, maybe some banker could charge you some exorbitant price for that. But
what are we talking about? Like 50,000 euros, 10,000, 100,000?
Well, if the banker, it takes a lot of time to make a good one. So I don't know. Maybe a banker would prepare that for, a boutique would do it for 100,000. I don't know.
Okay.
Possibly 200,000. Really depends on the boutique's opportunity cost, because they're going to be dedicating a lot of resources to that. When at the same time,
on top of the retainer, right? So.
Well, maybe if it's just preparing one document, the SIM, for example, which is probably the most important document, then the opportunity cost is just the time they have to dedicate to that versus working with a client that actually is more serious, where they're going to earn a success fee on completion of the transaction, and the success fee is usually much higher than that.
Okay. Now, the reason I'm asking about the retainer is because I seem to remember from our previous conversations, and obviously read a fair amount of books and articles in the past. And I know that when you're going through an M&A boutique and looking for a potential acquirer and whatnot, you have to be ready to pay a retainer for them to work on this. And then there's a success fee, of course.
Exactly.
Right? But if you want a good one, because obviously they will be traveling, they will be meeting people, they will be preparing documentation, will be taking meetings on your behalf. So there has to be a retainer, which I think back in the day used to be like at least 10 grand a month. So maybe it's even higher. I don't remember. That's the number I've got in my head right now. So that adds up to a lot of money. But of course, you're expecting you're expecting them to maximize the exit value so that you can compensate for these upfront costs.
Right. Exactly. So it's. Yeah, in preparing the document, just hiring somebody to prepare the document, I would, there's probably better ways to do it, more cost-effective ways, hiring some consultant, maybe a consultant who normally works on funding rounds, who, charges by the hour, who can just prepare that document for you, or just doing it yourself, and the negative part of that is obviously you have to invest the time yourself, but, having you can use your old investment deck and, spend quite a bit of time improving that. So that's an alternative as well.
That's actually a third point, right? Is trying to do it alone versus having help. So I think we have already stepped into this one. But I can't wrap my head around the idea of like doing this process alone, because it requires a lot of legalese, a lot of numbers, a lot of meetings, and as a CEO, you're losing focus 100%. If you're going for an exit, one of the most difficult parts is you cannot keep that information you have to keep that information from leaking into the team, right? Because you don't want the deal to fall through because the information has been leaked. On the other hand, it's like, how do you do that? And without the team noticing that you're just not working on what you're supposed to be doing as a CEO, because obviously you're focused on other kinds of meetings, right? So is there any occasion, any circumstance in which you would do it alone?
So you're always going to have to hire lawyers, because you need lawyers to work on your side of the final contract. And you probably want a lawyer, not mandatory, but you want a lawyer to take a look at the LOI as well. Yeah. You definitely change that. You definitely want a lawyer to look at the LOI as well. Although if you hire a financial advisor, we will look at the LOI as well. And usually the lawyer doesn't have any changes beyond the ones that we suggest. But in any case, it's always good to have a lawyer look at, all the documents. And you must have them look at the final contract. So, that's mandatory. Hiring a financial advisor, I would say, is highly recommended, not mandatory. So that's kind of how how I would consider it. But I mean, talking with founders, I meet founders, lots of founders. It's amazing. Try to do it alone, and it usually fails. So and the other ones, I had a conversation recently, and I've had many conversations like this, but one that stuck in my mind recently was a guy who he's basically been trying to do this for a considerable amount of time, I think more than a year. So he was talking with one group of buyers. He was trying to sell his own company for more than a year. So he was talking with one group of buyers last year, maybe kind of around the summertime, early fall, nothing, no great offer there. Now he's talking to a different group. So he's kind of like going through the different groups one by one, and his business is really suffering. So one of the most valuable things you can do if you're doing a proactive process is getting the offers at about the same time. So if you're talking to one group and then another group and then a third, a fourth, kind of going, it's just incredibly inefficient. And as you mentioned, Alex, it's such a drain on the business. So this guy, he was telling me that he was going to have to spend an entire week putting together like a technical due diligence, preparing for this. So that's an entire week he's not doing anything with his business. And he's the number one person at the business. And that's, obviously a bad week, but even in a good week, he's spending a good, 40, 50% of his time on this. And that's been going on for more than a year. So it's, extremely negative for the business. It's also negative for the sale value, if the sale even happens. Although in these types of situations, it seems like 90% of the time the sale does not happen. Even if they end up getting an offer, it seems it almost always falls through. So
right on. It would seem to me that maybe if you have sold, like, say, 3 to 5 businesses, maybe you want to, you have sufficient information and background and experience to sell the next one. But usually these kind of people who sell so many businesses, they the more businesses they create, the higher they grow. And so the bigger they grow. So maybe they're not ready for that next step. So right. I don't know. Like that would be kind of like my idea of when you would do it alone. But
but even in that case, I'm thinking of one of our past clients who tried to sell, who was a serial entrepreneur who sold multiple businesses. And then in the current business, he tried a couple times to sell it alone, and he did get offers. I don't know if any of them were written. At least one was a written offer, but every single time it fell through. And that's, really drained on his business. And then he finally hired us, and we did that sale, which was great. But, it's very difficult. It's a huge time drain.
Do you think that maybe that happened because, and going into the next point, he was not being responsive in communications, because by trying to juggle so many things at the same time, maybe he was not being super efficient in his communications, so that kind of delayed the whole process. And maybe the buyers were like, yeah, fuck it, I'm going to go for an alternative. Whereas by hiring you, you're on top of this and you can answer right away.
Yeah, exactly. I think that could have been one of the reasons. I'm thinking about this person specifically. But I think it doesn't matter. It's a general comment. And this person, when you're the CEO of a pretty big technology company, you're being pulled in many directions. You're extremely busy. In order to have had such success, you probably need to put in quite a bit of time and hours into your business. And these processes take an enormous amount of time. So even these type A people who are super successful and who are normally very responsive are not going to be able to be as responsive as usual, and they just need some support. So I think that's key. And one last quick comment on this is, I remember working on the buy side. I think even though we're sell side focused, having this perspective of the other side, kind of that empathy and that understanding of what they're looking for is so huge. And I remember, when we were reaching out, so I'm thinking about, for example, the last one we worked on was this Central European tech company that I explained before. And, reaching out to many parties, and some of them were very slow to get back. And they would just, they would really kind of get forgotten about a little bit, or, just other players were advancing much faster, and we're getting the excitement of our client much higher and getting much more focus from our client. So we were always trying to push these slow people to encourage them to move quicker to get more options for our client, the buyer. But yeah, I mean, keeping in mind, even if you're working inbound, if you're just an entrepreneur accepting inbound, or you're an entrepreneur doing a proactive process, but especially if you're accepting inbound, you've got to keep in mind that if you received an inbound, probably all your competitors and a lot of similar companies to you did as well. And some of them are going to be responsive and answering much quicker. And it really puts you at the back of the, at the back of the line, or however you want to think about it. It just, you're not going to get the mind share or the priority if you're slow every time, and some other similar companies are much faster and more dynamic looking than you. So,
but isn't it hard to calibrate an equilibrium between like answering too fast, because that's probably, it means that you're interested, but maybe it also signals that you're a little bit desperate, and playing it cool, which I don't know. I find it hard, right?
Exactly. And this is an interesting point. So now I think we're more on the inbound side. So an entrepreneur who's not in a proactive process, who's just receiving an inbound. So I think that makes, I think that's a fair point.
But even for outbound, like if you're answering too fast, maybe it's like, I'm in a rush, I'm running out of money or whatever, right? So isn't that decreasing the value of your company up front?
Well, if you're in an outbound, you don't look desperate because you hired a professional to do it. And the professional is just doing his job, his or her job, and the professional is, so that's just professionalism. And, but if it's an inbound, I see your point, and I could definitely I think that's a very fair point. So maybe wait, 2 or 3 days to respond to that email, and maybe, instead of, don't sound overly eager when you respond, say, hey, we're always, I don't know what the right response is because I don't do inbound, but, basically maybe something along the lines of, we're always open-minded, but certainly not looking for this. Happy to have a quick chat one day, something like that. Something casual and informal. I think it would be a good response, waiting 2 or 3 days.
I mean, the reason I'm asking all these questions is because obviously,
because you want to sell MarsBased.
I need them. No, of course not. But like, we're not in sales. But like, the problem is, like, in the last 6 months or so, we have been receiving so many outreach proposals of like, hey, would you be open to selling your company? Are you taking calls and all of that? It's like, obviously not. But some of them are from interesting companies that you are like, I don't want to burn any bridges with this company, so I don't want to tell them to fuck off right away, which is kind of like my book. But obviously, and some of them, in the past we've had, or in the past, and also maybe right now, but like in the past we did have our biggest client who wanted to acquire us in 2018, 2019, right? And so we're between a rock and a hard place, because you don't want to tell them no too upfront, because you don't want to lose them as a client. Maybe you say like, I'm not selling to you. Then that means, okay, I'm not buying any more services from you, right? So, and that's complicated. That's tricky.
In that case, I totally agree with you. And I think that's a great point. These inbound inquiries, the ones that come from interesting companies, I would absolutely, even if you have no interest in selling whatsoever at the moment, if you think at some point in the next 3 to 5 years, you may have some interest in selling, you should definitely have a nice conversation with them, start that relationship. And then, say, hey, look, I just, and make an excuse, I guess you have to make an excuse at the end. Maybe you wait for them to see what kind of offer they have, if it's a crazy FU number, like you were saying before, or you could cut it off before then and just say, hey, look, it was lovely to speak with you. At the end of the day, I spoke with my board and we're not in selling mode. Board of directors is one of the best, even excuses. If you don't have a board of directors.
We don't have a board, but I can totally use that.
It's the best excuse in the world. You can say, hey, look, I was really interested, and we are interested, but the board, at the end of the day, we had the meeting, and we're just it's nothing about you. If we were to sell, you would be our top pick, but we're not selling to anybody right now. So that's
so polite. That's so polite. My board is my 2 co-founders and I. So
well, I mean, exactly. You could say, hey, I wasn't able to speak with my co-founders before their call, and we did have a chat, and we love you, but we'll stay in contact.
Which brings me to, kind of like qualifying the parties you're speaking with, which is another point in your compendium of bulleted advices, right? Because, like, for instance, one of our clients, so it is a fintech, or it was a fintech startup from California called ValuationMetrics, and they sold to Citadel, right?
Okay.
And they kind of went another route, right? They didn't hire anybody, so basically they were selling to Citadel, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a similar case in which we find ourselves in. They were selling services to them, and at a certain point, I don't remember the entire story, but basically the conversations happen naturally and organically, right? It's like, well, why don't we buy you, right?
Yeah.
And so in a sense, that's good because you're selling to somebody that is qualified. You're serving them. That means that you have accepted them as a qualified customer, which is good. There's a cultural fit. You understand each other. They had been working for almost a year or for a year and a half, if I remember correctly. So that's good. On the other hand, you're limited to just one offer, right?
Yeah. And also, as you mentioned before, it can be a little bit sensitive at the end of the day. What if you don't come to an agreement? So it's kind of like, what if their offer, at some point they lower their offer and you don't want to accept it? I mean, do you have a high risk of losing your biggest customer? That's kind of... So
depends on how much value you add to them, because like they also, maybe the acquirer doesn't want to push it that much because it's like, oh, we really want this technology. So if we push it too much, then maybe they will just go away, right? So it depends on whether you're really valuable or just a commoditized kind of service to them.
True. Yeah. I mean, if you're so differentiated that you're confident they're not going to leave you no matter what, then that's a unique situation. When we do processes, typically what we recommend is not reaching out to clients in the beginning. And, kind of once you're further along and you're confident, this thing's going to happen, you're kind of getting in conversations where high values are being mentioned and, you have a high degree of confidence, then maybe at that point, if you think there's some clients you'd like to speak with because you'd really, value a long-term relationship with them, under their company, then maybe at that point to talk with them because if you talk with them in the beginning and nothing happens, and then maybe, there is that risk, even if it's small, to kind of burn the relationship a little bit. So
yeah, which is like, we've had several conversations with some companies. Some companies we really admire, we really like, but they came pretty coldly in the sense that, if we were to sell MarsBased, it would be to somebody that we had been working for a lot of time. Like even if we respect companies like, Basecamp or Buffer, like if we haven't worked with them, we don't know whether they're a good fit for us, right? We see them from the outside, but we don't know in the inside, right? I would be much more comfortable about selling our company to existing clients that we've got right now that maybe they're not Basecamp, they're not Google, they're not, companies that would be comfortable to selling to, but we know them, we're happy with them, we've been working for them for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and maybe it's not the best one in the world, but it would be a great sale. But I don't know. I'm just, definitely this is something that we're not considering. But
on the converse side of that, so on the converse side, if you're doing a proactive process, many times you'll reach out to a buyer and they will have the same, kind of feeling that you're expressing right now. They don't want to necessarily buy your company until they've worked with you. Okay. So they will kind of demand or say it's a prerequisite that we have at least some type of working relationship. Usually they'll call it a partnership or something.
Okay.
And then you'll be working together for 4 months or 6 months. And then, the acquisition can happen at that point with those particular parties.
So that would work for me to do business development for MarsBased. I reach out to many companies saying like, hey, maybe we want to sell so that we get their business. Would that work?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's a good point, Alex. I think you're a talented guy, so maybe you could figure that out.
I'm gonna try. Hey, Elon, I want to sell MarsBased to Tesla so that you can take the company actually to Mars. So.
Exactly. So I'm going to bless you, give you this gift of an offer to buy my company.
Exactly. But first, we have to work for at least 1 year together, right? So
at a very large contract, very high-paying contract.
No, I mean, wow. No, I mean, I didn't know this. I didn't know this perspective from the acquirer side, and it's really super interesting because obviously, also maybe they want to have like some Like they want to have you in the vendors pool. They want to qualify you regarding GDPR, regarding, financial security and whatnot. So
it's many different reasons. And yeah, you're hitting a lot of the points. And with your inbound points that you were mentioning before, Alex, I mean, a lot of them, if they could be potential customers, to try to get some type of customer or partnership type situation going, one, maybe you make some money on it. And two, later, you'll get comfort with them, and maybe you'll find that, hey, these guys would be a great acquirer of my company, and then you have that all lined up for, the future.
Okay, let's just jump into there's one point I want to skip because I feel like we've already covered as well, which is kind of like coordinating the outreach to the buyers. Because by working with a company like yours, for instance, it's pretty clear to me that you guys will be doing it perfectly, and you will be coordinating, you'll be communicating, you'll be on top of things, right? But there's one point here that is really interesting. One of the last 2 points is waiting too long is dangerous, right? Because I was in the when we were preparing this, I told you the example of a really good friend of mine. He had a really good offer to sell his company to Zoom in September, and 2 days after, he kind of stalled it a bit just because he was busy on other things, or maybe he was kind of negotiating with other companies. And 2 days after, the Zoom stock plummeted, right? And they withdrew the offer. So selling too early versus selling too late.
So waiting too long can mean many different things, but I think so that's an interesting example that you gave, Alex. And waiting too long can also, one of the things that I think about, given that this is my business, is the M&A cycle. So the M&A cycle has been very strong for many years, and it does move in cycles. So there will be a down cycle. And last year was an amazing year. This year is still strong. Not as good as last year.
So we're going down, you mean?
I hope not. I hope it's it can be a bump in the road, or it could be the beginning. So nobody knows. But in any case, when the down cycle begins, which still has not begun, in everybody, most people's opinion, when it begins, it can be, it could be 5 years until the M&A market is good again. So it's kind of, so that's one perspective. It might only be a 2 or 3 year wait, so it's, nobody knows, but in any case, it's going to be some significant duration. So that's one aspect. Another aspect of waiting too long is basically sectors gets consolidated. So once you see that, you hear about some of your competitors being acquired, they call it being the last man standing. So kind of when you're the last one out there, it's kind of all the eager parties to acquire a company similar to yours have already done so. And so you're kind of out there alone, and there's just not very many natural buyers. So that's another, that's kind of more, sector, subsector related, kind of your exact type of company or your sector to some degree as well. But that's another point. And as you mentioned, Alex, waiting, there's a famous, well, I think it's famous, a famous saying in deal making in general, whether it's M&A, real estate, or whatever. And this saying is time kills deals. So when you have something, when you're speaking with Zoom or whoever, if you're going too slow, when the iron is hot, you want to move. So if you start going really slow, something happens, and they lose interest. And it almost always happens when the deals go really slow. It just always, I can think of so many times, in my work that, for some reason we couldn't go as fast as we wanted to, we couldn't go at the right pace, and the slowness just killed the deal, and for whatever reason. And that's something to keep in mind as well.
And it's kind of like always you will hear some things like you never sell too early, but people always sell too late, right? It's like, well, I mean, there's some cases there. Certainly people are like, oh, YouTube sold too early. But in hindsight, that's confirmation bias, because maybe if they hadn't sold to Google that early, maybe they wouldn't have made it, because the competition would have been fierce, and maybe, another company would have taken much more capital. Maybe Google would have pumped millions into Google Video, which was disastrous, but maybe with sufficient backing and money would have overtaken YouTube in the #1 spot, right? So it's always difficult. Like in hindsight, everything makes sense, right?
And another,
go ahead.
Well, just a very quick last point. I know we're running low on time. It's just that, I speak with clients, and one who I was talking with recently said, hey, we think we're going to, we've got another year of really good growth, and then things are going to taper off. So it's like kind of like, I want to start the process once things taper off. Whereas actually, if you start the process now or soon, first of all, you can show a great trajectory while the process is going on, which will give you a significantly higher valuation usually. And secondly, the valuation is usually based on kind of end of the year numbers. So it's, for example, if you were beginning a process now and you were getting offers, well, now is too soon, but if you began a process, like for example, in in January or February, and you were getting offers in like May, June, those offers would be more predicated on your year-end numbers than your beginning of year numbers, if you're doing it in a good way. Maybe that's slightly early, but you get the idea. So it's but if you wait until growth is flat, then your valuation has come down and your attractiveness in general. Everything has come down. Valuation, just number of offers you're going to receive because you're looking like a boring company. So it's much better to have some positive momentum when you go to the market.
Because when you're selling, I think you can leverage on the what you can achieve. Not only what you have achieved, but you sell them your growth capacity, your hiring expertise and whatnot. And like, if we have taken this many markets, we could conquer all these other markets. So if your growth is already flat, that means there's no future. Like there's just a continuation.
It's not ideal. Let's put it that way.
Couple things here. I wanted to circle back to the think about like consolidations of the market, because one of the even if it's not the same market, I think that we're seeing the same kind of dynamics in right now the delivery market or the last mile and all of these like Globos, Gettiers and whatnot. Like we're seeing that only one will stand, right? Only one or two will stand in the global market, because that's what happened also with Uber and ride sharing apps. And 10 years ago in San Francisco, there were 10 or 15 different car sharing apps and ride sharing apps. Right now, there's only two, Uber and Lyft, right? And so same happened with the scooters. And one of our clients, Spin, that was acquired by Ford 5 years ago, and now has sold to Tier, which is kind of like a bigger player, like the biggest player right now in the market, right? So this is consolidation. I know they're not exactly the same market, but can you draw the parallelisms from similar markets to understand that this is what's going to happen in yet another market that maybe doesn't have the economics don't really make sense unless you're number one or two in the market, like in the case of deliveries?
Yeah, and also, I mean, what's popped in my mind when you started talking about that is network effects businesses can definitely have more this type of phenomenon, because the bigger the company is, the more value they provide. So it tends to be more of a winner takes all environment, as you were describing with deliveries. Whereas like, for example, a B2B software business, there's almost never a winner takes all, even if they're only a little bit different, you can have tons of players in those markets
and be super profitable because it's margin
profitable and successful. And, and that's wonderful. But in these B2C, often B2C businesses that are network effects businesses, which, if you're not familiar with network effects, a simplification is just to say the bigger the business is, the more value the recipients, the users receive. So anybody who's small just has a huge disadvantage, and the bigger players can start gobbling up the smaller ones. And so those types of businesses tend to be winner take all businesses in the end. So that's kind of the one thought that came to my mind when you mentioned that. I don't know if that was completely different than the question you were asking, but
no, it was precisely like that, because basically their economics are sustained by volume, not margin, and therefore they only make sense at an astronomical scale. And it's like only Uber and Lyft are making money, and I'm not even sure they're making. I think they're still not turning a profit, and maybe there should be only one to turn a profit.
It's totally true, because like Uber, Cabify here in Barcelona, are you going to use some small version of that? I mean, the most important thing about Cabify is when you press request a car, that you can get one in 2 or 3 minutes or 5 or 6 minutes maximum. And if a small little upstart comes along, maybe you have to wait 40 minutes or, it's just the volume of cars moving and the size of the business is adding so much value, just that fact alone. So, and same with Glovo, I only have Glovo in my phone because, a little smaller company has 25 restaurants. Glovo's got thousands of restaurants. I mean, there's no comparison in the value difference. So,
two quick questions before we wrap this up, because I want to be sensitive of your time. The first one is what happens with companies selling a part of their business to another company, right? In this case, Spin, like Ford sold Spin to Tier, right? In that case, like, how is the founding team involved, and is it really like, do usually like the selling part take on the cost and the effort to go for the sale, or is the CEO of, say, Spin in this case, is also involved in that process to selling to Tier? So how would it look like?
So this question, I just want to make sure I understand the question. So it's a company, it's basically a partial company sale. Is that kind of the question?
Yeah, exactly. So Ford had acquired Spin to be their kind of like mobility partner, and so they were acquired. And now 3 years after, we're like, we don't need this toy anymore. So they sold it to Tier, you know? So basically the biggest competitor, because maybe that's part of the consolidation market. They were a profitable company, so it's not like they were not sustainable, but maybe they were like a small fraction in the revenue of Ford, of course.
Yeah. So this is a slightly, so I would call this question more kind of related to, all right, you're under a parent company and the parent company wants to sell you. So Ford wants to sell you to another one. So I mean, those are situations where I think every situation is quite unique. And usually in this situation, given that Ford is 100% owner, they would be running that process. But at the same time, I think they probably want to have, what's the name of the business again that they sold?
Spin.
So I think they probably want to have the leadership of Spin on board and excited as well, because how many people are going to want to buy Spin if the leadership has, no interest? It's just kind of a...
Well, they left, so maybe they didn't. So that was the second part of the question. It's
So I mean, keeping that leadership interested, that's a key aspect that related to one of your points before at the very beginning was, if you just buy the technology versus buying a company that has people and technology, the example of people and technology almost always gets a much, many, many times higher valuation than just a technology. And it's somewhat similar in this example because, Ford is selling Spin, but Spin is, doesn't have any incentivized leadership. So it's just kind of, so I think my point is having this, whatever leadership they put into place, somehow incentivized through bonuses or whatever, is probably really important for Ford in order to get a good sale, and really important for the buying company, so that when they buy Spin, they feel like they're getting a company, an asset that has, bright and exciting future prospects. So having, a good leadership who is incentivized in that company, I would imagine, that seems like the best way to do it.
Yeah, it's kind of like the second part of the question was, how can you incentivize people to stay when your company gets sold? Because, like, for instance, I'm pretty sure that if we sold the company to somebody, like, half of the company would leave because they would be like, well, this is not the company I signed up for, unless there was a huge incentive. Like, one of the things I've got in my mind, if I'm ever to sell this company, and I hope there's people from the company listening to these podcasts, like, I'm not going to sell, like, I wouldn't sell this company if I wasn't able to sign a deal in which everyone in the company can buy a house with cash up front, because that way they can stay in the company. Otherwise, like, all of these companies approaching us are like, yeah, we want to have your assemble team of 15 developers, 20 developers. I'm like, yeah, sure, but what's their incentive to stay? Because so far you're only incentivizing me to sell the company because I'm going to get a nice bonus and cash the fuck out. But they will be like, they are not forced. They are not under any any constraint. They're not, they're not forced to stay. How can you incentivize that they stay in the company? Because you're buying me because of them, but you're not passing the value on to them, right?
Yeah, I mean, the most common and most simple way that I see is just bonuses.
Like vesting?
Well, they can do vesting, or they can just have,
permanence
bonuses, both permanence and performance, a combination of the two. So, doing it that way as well. And I've even seen situations where the CEO, in your case, or the top people, if they really want them to stay, I mean, they can do bonuses as well, or in the share purchase agreement, they can have it so that a significant part of your sales proceeds come, at the end of year one, end of year two, so that you have to stay in order to get those proceeds. So it's basically there's the options in these, company sale, acquisition agreement contracts are as far as the mind and imagination can take you, really. I mean, there's a lot of different structures, a lot of bonuses, a lot of delayed payments, and maybe not. So you need to have a good lawyer on your side. But at the same time, if permanence is really important to the buying party, then they need to have that confidence that you're going to stay, and there needs to be things put in place so that you will stay and will perform well also.
Yeah, because I always felt like most part of these, because we've seen a lot of our competitors or similar companies selling in the past, right? We've seen Broker Rails sold to Shopify, our friends at CodeGram sold to Factorial. There's been a bunch of people just selling, closing their companies. Others are considering. I think the Carbon 5 also sold to like a big consultancy in the States. So it's like, it makes you wonder how many have taken like the quick way of just selling and cashing out, and I don't care that much about the team, and that's it. And how many have actually taken time to get the best value possible for all their team if they really cared about them all that much, right? So it's, I don't know, maybe I'm getting too philosophical here, but
it's important, and it is a little bit philosophical, and I really respect that you're bringing this up, but also keep in mind,
because if you sell your company based on 15 developers and then day one 10 quit, like then the acquiring company will not be happy with you, and you are forced to stay in the company. There will be 5 years or 3 years or 2 years, whatever time required to be there. They will be mad at you because you didn't fulfill the promise.
The only thing to keep in mind is that most of the acquiring companies do have professional help, and they have people on their team that are very experienced in this, and they will have thought of that. So they, unless they've done a really poor job, I mean, they should be thinking, I'm sure it happens. But I mean, they will be thinking usually, how can we keep this is somewhat of an acqui-hire. We got to keep the employees excited with the company, motivated to perform well. So what do we put in place to make that happen? So
a really disastrous example, we had a client that sold in 2017 or 18, I don't remember right now, and because the acquiring company wanted their market share, and so they had like 3 really big clients. They wanted to acquire these 3 really big clients. Yeah. And by day one, the 3 clients are like, no, we're not working with you. Bye. So they squandered the money. They were left with nothing. The entire team left. That was like, okay, we lost money. And I don't know, probably that was the most disastrous acquisition in history. Anyways, Mike, I don't want to take more of your time. Any parting words, any other final advice I want to share with our audience before we wrap it up?
No, but I think this was great. Really enjoyed it. Thanks again, Alex. Pleasure to speak with you. And
pleasure's mine.
We'll do it again at some point in the future.
Part 4.
Part 4, exactly. No, but I think I'd like to invite all the listeners, anybody who is, interested in some process like this, maybe not now, but in the next few years, feel free to reach out. Would love to have a quick chat, or if there's actually, more to talk about, it doesn't need to be a quick one. But yeah, feel free to reach out, and love to, love meeting entrepreneurs. And yeah, it's my business. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, in 10 seconds. So when do you know is the right moment to reach out to you, Mike, to sell the company?
Well, I would say, I mean, personally, I like developing a relationship with entrepreneurs. So I would say if you're thinking about selling your company in the next, few years, it would be great to have a quick chat. I'd love to, begin that relationship. And I think that benefits both sides, because when we do work together, it's just a much more seamless and comfortable and it's a situation with high confidence from the beginning. So I would say anybody can reach out. Obviously, if you have an urgent, M&A need or question, don't hesitate, reach out, now or whenever you feel like it. So.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Pleasure. See you later.
Next time.